Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special Social Blooper interview. And friends, we are filming today, October 6th, just 24 hours, not even, before the tragic anniversary of October 7th, 2023. And here in Australia, we want to try and bridge that gap between Australia and Israel. And not only that, we also want to further understand what has happened over the last 364 days. And I can't think of anybody better to spend this time with than somebody from Australia who's an educator who has also made Aliyah. So she is very familiar with both here in Australia and Israel. And I'm pleased to welcome Adina Bankier-Karp. And Adina has authored a very, very timely report on anti-Semitism. And she's also going to be able to tell us a little bit more about the mood over in Israel, over here as well, what we can do. And finally, during this auspicious time, right now we are between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, one of the most auspicious times of the year, how we as Jews can help ourselves. With that, Adina, welcome.
Greg, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today.
Adina, October 6th, 2023, and October 7th, you are Shomer Shabbat. Just tell us your lived experience.
Greg, thanks for this opportunity to reflect on the events of that day and the
Yeah.
aftermath. In July 2021, my family and I made Aliyah from Melbourne, Australia. I'm a high school teacher. I've got a doctorate and a research affiliateship at the Australian Centre of Jewish Civilization, where I do research about Australian Jewry, identity formation, mental health, and Jewish engagement. On October the 7th was Shabbat, and it was Simchat Torah, which is the end and the beginning of the cycle of reading the Torah. I was at my home in Jerusalem, and my family had already left to go to a much earlier Simchat Torah service, and I was preparing to join a later one. It was just after 8 a.m., bag in hand, about to step out the front door when the first siren sounded.
Wow.
I remember that first siren vividly. I was shocked. We don't have a mamad, a safe room, in our apartment. I went out to the stairwell of our building, and I shouted up the stairwell that if there's anyone upstairs, come down. I'll open up the miklat. The miklat is the shared bomb shelter for our building.
Right.
So I hauled open that heavy door, and everyone from our building hurried inside. We hauled it closed and waited. I felt that first boom in my guts. It's
Wow.
the young woman in the first floor apartment, cried. She couldn't stop shaking. We just sort of held her until she was okay. But then 10 minutes later, I rushed off to synagogue. And that might sound insane. I'd committed to attending an Orthodox women's prayer service and didn't want to let my friends down. I
Okay.
arrived at the synagogue, and the guard said that the service had been cancelled. And I said to him, why? And he said, Ki yesh chetzi milchama. There's a half a war. And I turned to him and I said, what's a half a war? Like, what does that mean? Like, I kept Shabbat. I didn't check my phone. I strapped on my heels, and I
Right.
bolted off to shul. I had no concept at that time of how unusual and how really problematic it is that there were sirens in Jerusalem of all places. And
Right.
also, no concept of the events that had already and that were continuing to unfold at that time. I rushed to a friend who lived nearby, and we then went to another friend, and we gathered together, three childhood Aussie friends, and we tried to give. They've got younger children, so we tried to give them a great Simchat Torah experience, and we were singing and dancing and showering them with lollies. COVID taught us how to do home-based Judaism, so we tried to do that. The sirens sounded repeatedly over the next few hours and sent us in and out of the shelter.
So you knew something
One
was
of the men,
very different than normal.
yeah, we knew something was different, but we had no concept of what that was. However, one of my friend's husbands holds a fairly senior position in the army, and he called in for an update to know whether he was needed. He wanted to
Right.
find out what was happening. His daughter and son also are in the midst of their national service, so they called their commanding officers also and were told stand by. And slowly over the course of the next few hours, information started to trickle in through those friends of mine who are currently serving, and also through the very, very wonderful non-Shabbat observant neighbours who saw us, assumed that we keep Shabbat, and said, look, here's an update. So they, of their own volition, came up to us and said, look, you need to know what's going on. And they told us, and at first we'd heard that a few people had died on some kibbutzim near Gaza. And then a few hours later came news of a few kidnappings. And then police actually started to patrol in the suburbs in Jerusalem to prevent opportunistic crime and also to prevent anyone from rising up against anyone else. So that was already starting to get a bit scary. It was getting very close to home.
And speaking of home, where were your kids? Your children?
Right. So after a few hours of Simchat Torah singing and dancing, I realized my family were probably really worried about me because none of us had phones. So I sprinted home. I was pretty scared that there'd be a siren when I was far from buildings and from shelter. So it was as fast as I think I'm capable of sprinting in heels. I went to my mother straight away and I checked on her. She was okay. We were supposed to host them for lunch, so I arranged that we'd bring the food to her because she had the better shelter. Then what was amazing was that as I was running home, and for those who are familiar with Katamon, the Katamon area, I was running straight down Hapamach, and it was like a scene out of a movie.
Really?
As I was sprinting along Hapamach Street, these vans were rolling up to apartment buildings, and young men were bolting out of apartments, literally boots untied, untucked, carrying these ridiculously small bags, ridiculous in hindsight, considering how long some of them would then be fighting. Right. And they were jumping into the crammed full cars and vans, and they were hurtling off down the road. And I felt like we were at war, but I had no idea what that meant because we'd heard bits and pieces, but nothing that gave us the full picture that we were to start. And again, a full picture never emerges immediately, but that we were starting to sort of piece together. So I found my husband, I found the children, we went off, we had Simchat Torah lunch with my mother, still no idea of the full extent of what had happened. And after Simchat Torah, we turned on our phones and became aware of the horrors that I'm sure most of your viewers became aware of. We did. The Gazans had breached the security fence. An unknown number of people had been killed. An unknown number of people had been captured and taken into Gaza. We were horrified. This was the multi-billion-dollar high-tech fence that was supposed to protect the people who were living on the border. Where was the army? Where was our Air Force?
Right.
It was a time where, all of the foundations below our feet just fell away. Right. And in the October 7 aftermath, I, like many, was glued to social media. I wanted to know, I wanted to bear witness to the full horrors that had occurred and that had been perpetrated against my people. After a few days, I was thoroughly sick, physically sick, and I realized that watching that much social media was unhealthy for me and unhealthy for my family. We made a deliberate, principled family decision to strictly limit the amount of time that we were spending on social media. My boys were then, they had schooling online, so we were all at home again. And we spent time watching news in a very limited way and decided to significantly filter the content that we were consuming. Most Israelis that I know oscillate between this desperate, urgent, voracious need to be informed, but also the desire to shield themselves against re-traumatization. In the weeks and the months that followed, I really felt a profound sense of disconnect. As a not quite Israeli, but not quite Australian, I was living in this liminal space between two identities that I yearned for, but I didn't really feel that either was fully representative of who I was, or that I wasn't deserving of the title of either of those identities. There are 10,000 Australians who have made Aliyah since 1948, and many of them that I've spoken to since have said that they really felt the pang of that liminality. So I'd not done any national service. I was too old by the time we came, and my children are too young to have enlisted either.
Right.
Yes, I have friends, I have former students, I have family who then went on to serve, but at the time I really felt like a bystander, and I just wanted to do something meaningful to embrace my Israeliness and to be part of my people. So I started volunteering already on, I think, October the 8th or 9th. We
Right.
started purchasing toiletries and making up little care packages to send to the south. Toiletries, socks, undies, deodorant at the beginning. Then I started big time baking babka and challah and sending it down to army bases on Thursday nights.
Right.
Army rations aren't anything that's any fun. We started packing sandwiches. We packed cold weather kits when the weather turned cold for the soldiers. I sorted donated clothes that were made available to the displaced people who started filling the hotels of Jerusalem around the area.
Right.
I joined WhatsApp groups that were saying Tehillim. So, you know, there's the pragmatic, there's the hopeful, there's the aspirational, there's the spiritual. And that was making people so busy. People were so
Right.
busy packing things, going to the airports, picking up bags that had been sent across unaccompanied, and making sure that those were all distributed where they were needed most immediately. Um, and then, of course, there's Australia. So, you know, the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel protests in Australia were starting to get serious. So I reached out to an Australian community leader, incredible funders, and together with David Graham, one of my wonderful colleagues in Sydney, we ran a national survey to get a snapshot of what was happening to
And,
Australian Jewry.
and tell us about that because that is your heart skill, if you will. It is doing something, obviously, both in Israel and both in Australia. What were the big findings?
There were lots of big findings. I think if I can collapse them down to the three main topics, the first being Israel attachment. The overwhelming majority of Australians care very deeply about Israel. There is a small, tiny fringe. Now, the reason why I can say small, tiny fringe is because, unlike a lot of surveys that have been conducted,
Right.
the survey that I conducted with David Graham was done with the same kind of methodology that we used for Gen 17 and Gen 08. And by that, I mean because Australia, unlike many countries in the world, because Australia has a religion question on the census and it's responded to with a very, very high percentage of input, we're able to know how our survey is reflective of that population. And without getting into too many complicated statistics, we
Right.
applied what are called post hoc weights to align the survey by age, by sex, by state, and by level of Jewish engagement
Right.
with the Australian community. So although we had a large sample, a sample isn't meaningful. The size of the sample is never as meaningful as its representativeness of the broader population that it purports to represent.
Right.
So we had a sample of over 7,600 people. But what we were able to do was to align it by sex, by age, by state, and Jewish engagement, which meant that we were able to ascertain the extent to which our findings were representative of the broader population.
Right.
The proportion, the percentage of Australian Jews who love Israel, who are committed to Israel, who visit Israel very regularly, who have family and friends in Israel, that was very high.
Right.
And those who have no Israel attachment, who have very, very little concern for the fate of Israel, its soldiers, its people, they're a tiny, tiny proportion.
Right.
And I guess that was very helpful to people who were quite alarmed when certain media outlets in Australia were calling on Australian Jews to speak about their feelings about Israel and about Australia
Right.
and anti-Semitism and Zionism. It was very helpful for us to be able to communicate to Australian Jewish community leaders and those who were committed to supporting Israel to actually be able to empirically prove that this was a group that was not representative of the broader Australian population. So,
Okay.
from I guess an on the ground grassroots level, that was very important. What was also very important, moving to opinions about the war. The overwhelming majority of Australian Jews were very supportive of the IDF, very, very concerned about Israeli Jews. And there was a level of compassion there for the citizens of Gaza. And in those early weeks, when it became clear that it wasn't just Hamas that entered Israel, but that there were citizens of Gaza who not only came in to loot and pillage after that original, the
Yeah.
initial wave of militants, terrorists, but also that they celebrated with gusto afterwards. I think it was quite remarkable that Australian Jews were able to hold this love and concern for Israel, but also have this concern for human life.
Right.
And if I see that reflected in Israeli Jewry, what's really amazing is the extent to which the IDF took amazing measures, overwhelmingly endangering its own citizens, its own army, to try and ensure that they were going after Hamas and that they were not going after citizens. Now, that's something that mainstream media may not necessarily have communicated, but I think it's very important for people to realise not just that we have an army that is moral, we have an army that is overwhelmingly made up people under the age of 21 who also need to look at themselves in the mirror at the end of their service and say, we did this because this is who we are as a people. Life is sacred to us, no matter what. So whilst that might have made certain military objectives extremely difficult, I think what Australian Jews need to realise is that, and they know this, that the army is made up of my neighbours, my friends' children, my friends who sat with us yesterday for Shabbat lunch.
Right.
And they need to continue being good people. And so how we fight matters to us, I think, more than it matters to the spectators.
Got it. What a great answer. Adina, also, can you get into any specifics about the safety factor in Australia, as in, do Australian Jews here feel safe? And also, the reason I asked the question about when specifically the report was conducted is because this is my own opinion, is that whatever the statistics were then, I think they've been exponentially magnified since that time period.
Well, unfortunately, we're working with data now that's not new.
Right.
So I can quote from that data now. So in Gen 17, when they were asked, if at all, what kind of a problem is anti-Semitism in Australia today, in Gen 17, 52% of people said it's a little, and 3% said not at all. But in Gen 17, there were only 6% of people who said that it's very much a problem.
Right.
Right. So if you're looking at 6% saying it was very much of a problem, 38% saying it was somewhat of a problem, and 52%, so the majority, saying not at all.
Right.
Well, that 6% that said it's very much a problem expanded out to 64.
Wow.
Right. And this is 5 weeks after October 7. We're not talking about now when, we have the culmination of many additional events that occurred in Australia.
Yes.
So if we were to collect data today, you and I can guess at how much more that might expand it out. There is a need for additional research, and we're beginning the groundwork for doing something like that, but nothing official yet. We're hoping to conduct a second survey to understand how Australian Jews are feeling this year, and hopefully we'll be able to have a discussion about that when we have some data in our hands that we can work with.
Great. Hey, Adina, now moving the proverbial camera, thousands of kilometers away to where you are right now. And this is obviously an open-ended type of question, but how do Israelis feel right now, especially given that we have, as we discussed, had some tactical success on the ground over the last number of weeks?
Greg, that's such it's a difficult question to unpack.
Yeah.
Because we have, if we were to use the expression "skin in the game,"
yeah,
people have different levels or layers of skin in the game. So, there are the people who have lost loved ones, and for them, there's a world of pain that only those who have lost can really understand. There are those who are dealing with incredible injuries to themselves or their loved ones. So there's those sorts of layers, and they might be engaged with the news, they might not, but they've got their world of pain and grief and loss that they're engaging with. Moving a few layers further along, you've got the internally displaced whose kids are yet again starting another school year. in a hotel, in an Airbnb, at the grace of the hospitality of friends far from home, wondering whether their homes are still standing and what they're going to find when they return.
Right.
We have friends who've been called up. We have friends whose children are currently serving in places that you and I can only imagine and aren't seeing much on the news.
Right.
Um, then then you've got, I guess, you've got the Israelis, and then you've got those people in the funny liminal space that I see myself in, who are kind of a bit Israeli and kind of a bit Australian,
Right.
and don't really have as much skin in the game. And I don't
Okay.
mean that with indifference. And sometimes I feel that with a deep frustration, relief that I don't have more skin in the game in the
Right.
sense of grief and loss, but at the same time, not emotionally being able to really fully connect and understand. I think that I would. I mean, I'm very cautious about speaking for all Israelis
Of
on any
course.
issue. But yeah, there was a sense of, I think, relief and finally about
Right.
the events of the past 3 weeks. But things are complicated here.
Yeah.
People have, this is a personal view that I think that for anyone who has a deep sense of connection to Israel, wherever they live,
Right.
I think I think they want to see Israel as they want to see their reflection when they look in the mirror. They
Right.
want to see a country that reflects their own values.
Sure.
And those values might be religious or cultural. They might reflect their conception of the state and its relationship to power, its relationship to our neighbours,
Right.
and some who live amongst us. So that's a really, really complicated question to
Yeah.
answer. And I think there is a sense of momentum, certainly, but with that momentum, there are people missing from my shore.
Right.
There are people who've come back on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. The first two people to get called to the Torah on Rosh Hashanah
Yeah. Please
were
tell the story.
yes, they were making the blessing of Hagomel, which is the blessing that anyone recites if they've been in mortal danger. And that set the tone in our synagogue that was quite palpable. It was extremely powerful.
Right.
And I think when you're surrounded by people who have skin in the game, yes, it's wonderful to dream of a future where all Israelis can go back to their homes. And I don't just mean those who've been displaced, those who've been forcibly removed from their homes. To have there's a little prayer that I wrote on a post-it note that I stuck in my siddur and I say every morning, that basically ends with return all of them complete to their homes, and to their families, as
Right.
soon as possible. And that's has multiple meanings, but it would be lovely to see all of those people home. But in order to bring those people home, there's a lot of our very, very young people and some of our not so young people
Right.
who have to put themselves in a lot of danger, a lot of really, really serious danger, and make some really, really, really difficult decisions
Right.
to make that happen. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
Mm.
Adina, as I mentioned, it is that time of year between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And as you said, seeing these kids, anything that we can do as Jews to help strengthen our resolve?
Um, there's the part of my head that thinks as a social scientist,
Yes.
a mother, an educator, and then as a proud praying Jew. So I'll
Right.
start with the proud praying Jew first. I think we're pretty invincible when we're united, and that's a difficult thing for Jews to do. United doesn't mean that we have to be the same. I don't think
Right.
that that's not going to happen. We were born as 12 tribes. I don't think
Yeah.
it ever meant that we were monolithic, but united in purpose. And I think Jonathan Sachs was the one who said united in diversity. I think that's something that we can aim for. And I think that there are many things that the majority of Jews can agree on, and the safety of the almost 10 million people behind the borders of Israel is something I think that a lot of Jews can agree on.
Right.
And the more that we can do that brings us together, and that you know prayers are sometimes scripted and poetic, and reflective and very powerful. And sometimes the most powerful prayers that are said, burst forth from an emotion-filled heart,
Right.
and they've changed history. The first day of Rosh Hashanah, Hannah, who's really the architect of modern prayer, her prayers are described as being thrown forth,
Right.
as bursting forth from the depths of despair. What I can say is, as a parent and as an educator, is that prayer has not just been canonized in the Jewish prayer book because she asked for something. It's also because she said thank you afterwards, and
Right.
that's all about building positive relationships. But I think that there's so much that we have in common, and I think across political divides in Israel, when you set aside media reports and you talk to the human beings and you talk to people from across the spectrum, whether it's at a supermarket, in a taxi, on a bus,
Right.
I'm always warmed and comforted by how much we really do have. That can be something that can give us strength. I think all of us have non-Jewish friends who are supportive, maybe not vocal, maybe not courageously loud on social media, but we have those
Right.
friendships. And David Graham and I published an analysis actually of the War Report data, which did show that people's mental health is not improved by excessive exposure to social media.
What
But
a surprise.
those, yeah, I don't think we needed the report to know that. But one thing that was really powerful is that the support of non-Jewish friends who have reached out to you, have reached out to us, and have told us that they believe in us, that they're praying for our safety, that they hope everything is well, and that they've started looking at not just mainstream media to
Right.
understand what's going on here, has been very helpful. It's been wonderful to know. We had our second apocalyptic moment a few nights ago. The first one was Erev Pesach,
Okay.
and the last one was Erev Rosh Hashanah. So all of us were busy in the kitchen preparing, setting tables, putting cake in the oven and challah and the
Right.
rest of it. And that was rudely interrupted by our little apocalyptic moment. But
Crazy.
the emails, the SMSs that I received, not just from family, but from those friends in Australia, asking how I was really, it's a very, very powerful thing. I think that
Right.
all of us can lean into our friendships a lot more, Jewish and non-Jewish, and show that appreciation for people being there to support us. I think that's a powerful thing. But for one thing that I've seen from the advocacy that Israelis have been doing and also Australian Jews have been doing, standing up for ourselves, fighting for the truth, using evidence to decry and to, I guess, counter some of the incorrect assertions and allegations that have been made against Australian Jews, against Jews in general, against the state of Israel. I think every Jew has a smartphone, and not every Jew has a smartphone, but every Jew that has a smartphone or some kind
Right.
of digital connection can be an advocate, and can be an advocate in their way.
Yes.
Sometimes that's just by telling their own story and making it completely personal. And sometimes it's by quoting the now very familiar facts of the day of October 7, of the history of the Jewish people, our indigeneity in this land, our spiritual
Yes.
claim to the land, etc. I think there's lots we can do.
Yeah, and that's a message, and I guess a message of hope. And the Jewish people are the people of hope, aren't we? We're not victims.
I think you can be whatever you want to be, but I think it makes a lot more sense to focus on hope.
Right.
There's some fascinating debates surrounding just prior to the foundation of the state. There was a question about what would the national anthem be, and in the end, it was Hatikva. It was hope.
Right.
Um, we don't believe in miracles. We rely on miracles, and we rely on hope. But I don't think we're doing it out of some kind of desperate um, psychological need. I think that there's a lot that has happened here historically, but also more recently that does give us very, very good reason to believe and to have hope. If I can talk about the immediate aftermath of October the 7th,
Definitely.
um, the young Israelis and not so young Israelis who flooded in from all over the world, sitting on the floor of planes and demanding to be taken home so that they could go rushing to the border and defend us. That continues to inspire me,
Right.
I see it in my neighbours who pass me by when I'm walking down our street. It's an incredible thing, those nose ringed hippies with their tattoos who are wandering off to find spirituality in India, who are now coming home to defend their homeland. Got a lot of faith in the future generation.
Wow.
Um, I think they've done incredible things, and I think this was a generation that many might have worried about in terms of their values and in terms of their nationalism. But it's quite clear from what they've been prepared to do for their country, where their loyalties lie and what their values are. Another thing that was really amazing, any Australian who's ever been to Israel knows that you can measure the speed of light by the lapse in time between the light turning green, traffic light turning green, and the guy behind you honking his horn.
Yes.
And yet, when I stood in line at the blood donation drive with thousands of Israelis waiting to donate blood, um, and there was no jostling, there was no complaining, and for a typically
Really.
impatient people, that was quite a remarkable thing. There were musicians who came and volunteered and played music to the people waiting in line, so that their waiting wouldn't be as painful as they're not used to waiting. There was a Hasidic family who came in with catering and were handing out rogalach and burekas and
Right.
encouraging us to, so that we could give good blood, which is full of sugar, to the soldiers. Israelis at their finest, and I guess
Right.
the Israelis also, and Jews who flooded in from all over the world later on, who stepped up to volunteer in all sorts of really, really remarkable ways. I think all of us are approaching tomorrow with, as I guess in a way, similar to the way that sometimes some of us approach Yom Kippur, with a little bit of trepidation.
Yeah.
And I think Naomi Shemer captured that quite well in her song Al Hadvash Ve'al Ha'oketz, the bitter mingled with the sweet.
Right.
It's a time of very, very painful memories. And it's not just memories, it's ongoing.
Yeah.
Psychologists today here are not talking about PTSD. It's not post. We're not in a post era yet.
Right.
We're in trauma now. When Erev Yom Ha'atzmaut, when the plan was still for the Air Force to fly a few planes overhead, they were doing drills over
Right.
Jerusalem. And there was a plane that flew very, very close overhead. And I was supervising an exam in a classroom. And a student just leapt to her feet and just started flapping her arms. And I went up to her and I looked her in the eye and I said, Zot Hagana, lo sakana. This is protection. This is defense. It's not danger. And I kept
Right.
saying it with her until she stopped. She stopped flapping and she
Right.
sat down and then she sort of put back on her
Yeah.
swagger. She went back into it. She was her Israeli self again. But you don't have to scratch too deeply below the surface to see that. The kids who leave their Ugg boots at the end of their beds because they know they might have to make a bolt to a shelter. Um,
Wow.
we don't have a mamad in our apartment. We've got a miklat, a shelter just outside our apartment, which services the whole building. And when we made a sprint for the miklat, Erev Rosh Hashanah, we were there with another two families who also have apartments in our building.
Right.
And the couple on the top floor have their grandchildren staying with them, or they happen to be coming to visit. They had a
Right.
3-year-old and a 4-year-old who, they didn't even hear the bombs. They just heard the sirens and they started sobbing. You've
Uh,
got people who have resilience and tenacity, and we're not going anywhere. But at the
right.
same time, there's good reason to get more than
Right.
butterflies when you hear those sirens.
Yeah. No, no, definitely. I think it's really well said and about the different range of emotions all at the same time, right?
Yeah, I said to a friend when she called after the sirens and after we'd come back inside. I mean, we were in the miklat for well over half an hour, and when we came inside, she said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I think I have emotional whiplash." Because on the one hand, I'm looking at this beautiful dining room table set for 18 with pomegranates and apples and honey and flowers and
Yeah.
eucalyptus leaves in there with a little hint of Australia. And on the other hand, I have a backpack by the door that we call the apocalypse bag, that we pick up as we bolt out the door and have done so a dozen times, probably less than a dozen times because we're in Jerusalem and it's quite unusual
Right.
to have rockets here. And yet, um, and yet,
I guess, Adina, it is complicated, is the best way to put it at this point in time. Adina, you were recently at a Shabbat table for dinner with a very gregarious family. Maybe just tell us a little bit about that.
I think it's an important postscript. As we were saying, Israel continuously and consistently ranks in amongst the happiest countries in the world. In fact, I think in the 2024 data that I looked at in the last few weeks, we're right up underneath the Nordic countries at spot number 4 or 5. The United States and Australia way below 20. And it's a wonderful thing to marvel on and chew on when you consider that we have rockets flying overhead.
For
But I will
sure.
share this anecdote. I was at this Shabbat dinner a few weeks ago, and there were young women there. And one woman in particular is actually a graduate at the school that I'm now teaching at. And she was shining. And she was in a beautiful summer dress, but she was glowing in a way that I have not really encountered before. And I asked her what she did. And she said that she was training to go into the all women's tank corps. You just need to Google and find out what they did on October 7. They were quite a spectacular group. And I said, "What have you done this week?" And she said, "I just finished a 100-kilometer run." And I said, "Why aren't you under the table? Why aren't you fast asleep?" And she said, "Because I know what I'm all about. I know what my mission is. I know what my purpose is. From the second I get up in the morning to the second I collapse into my bed at night, I know what I'm here to do." She said, "I'm so proud of my country and I'm so excited to serve it and defend it." And it makes sense. Israelis know now what it is that we're here to do. We know who we're here to support. We know the magnificence of our people. You can be gardening or, not too far from home and stumble across something that is both quite ancient and quite modern.
Right.
And that's the magnificence of living here. That intermingling of the ancient and the modern. But in that is the ancient promise and the very, very modern Israelis who are here to protect that.
Adina, thank you so much. Any closing comments for us here in Melbourne?
Um, I actually wanted to, yeah, there's a few things. I guess there's the lessons learned,
Yeah,
and some closing thoughts.
definitely.
I've already told you why it is that I have hope. But I think that there's probably a few things that I do need to counter that hope with, and that is, I guess, the three shatterings that we're still making sense of. The first one was, I guess, as a believing Jew, as a believing Jew, one does believe that God's protection, which perhaps I'd taken for granted, was not a guarantee in the face of our internal divisions.
Yeah,
It's the Haggadah starts by saying, "Where do we begin? How far do we go back when we tell the story of the Jewish people?" And
right.
the Haggadah stretches even further back before the Jewish people are a people and even before Abraham, to try and say that there's just so much backstory that we need. And I can't look at October 7 without looking at the events that were occurring in Israel for the year prior. The disunity and the protests and the rage, the inability of family members and friends at a Shabbat table to sit peaceably together sometimes.
Right.
Um, like many others, I was so frightened that the lack of unity had destroyed or profoundly compromised the merit that we might have had, that
Right.
undergirded our protection. So um, God's not a coin slot vending machine. We
Yeah.
need to earn that protection, and that was something that was driven home to me. I think that whether it's prayer, good deeds, unity, we're counting on Jews from all over the world to help us merit that protection in this tough neighbourhood.
Yeah.
Second one was, I guess, the shattering, like many had, shattering of the assumptions that the IDF could always protect us.
Right.
I was raised on the epic stories of the Davidka operation,
Right.
Entebbe, the Six-Day War. Um, could it be that that era was over? Those were the thoughts that were
Right.
flying through my mind at that time. And I guess lastly, I was crushed on the Australian front by the silence of Australian leadership.
Yeah.
Australians had always been so relaxed and accepting, and now as in the aftermath, as the public celebrations of atrocity and terrorism were metastasizing, all I saw was impotence and apathy and hatred towards Jews. I
Yeah.
feared that the Australia, not just the Jewish community, but the country that 5 generations of my family had called home, and was having its social fabric torn apart, and that was something that really frightened me. But on the other hand, there were also the things that inspired me.
Adina, as you said, it's very complicated. As you said, the other words were emotional whiplash. Certainly, that's a phrase that describes the situation at hand perfectly, I think.
Just as one will postscript, I think the events or the significance of the events of October 7 really can't be, and I guess the past year can't be overstated. I think it shapes and has reshaped the way that we as Israelis, and I guess as Jews worldwide, think about our security, our unity, our values, and our sense of purpose. I think we know more clearly now who our friends are, for
Yes.
better or for worse. And I think that we know that we, the Jewish people, are capable of extraordinary courage, generosity, and resilience. And that thought really sustains me. I heard a quote once that the Jewish people are just like everyone else, only more so. And I think we're incredible. I think we knew that
Yeah.
before, and I think we know it more now. I believe even more in the importance of unity, and I hope that we can sustain it. Um, I've experienced strength that comes through serving others. The volunteering that we did for the weeks and months afterwards, I think, surprised us in what we were capable of doing and giving. And that was remarkable across Israeli society. I've seen it in my own students. I teach at a local high school.
Right.
And the same students who are running their own households, whose fathers are defending the borders and whose mothers are trying to keep the businesses afloat. These girls are busy holding markets so that internally displaced people can sell their wares on the basketball court of our school. The power that comes from serving others is overwhelming, and the generosity in that, the fierce generosity in that, has just been mind-blowing to see in my high school students, which has been incredible.
Wow.
And I think that these experiences have reaffirmed my belief in the potential of Israel and the Jewish people to rise above even the darkest of moments. Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you, Adina.